All right, everyone. Well, I think we will go ahead and get started here so we can make sure we are wrapped up and finished within the next hour for you guys. So thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar on transitioning to zero emissions technology. Um, I'm I'm Minda Cook. Many of us have interacted in the past. I help support Thermo King with media relations. And just a couple items that I wanted to touch on before I hand things over to our presenter today. So today we're going to be discussing the motivations behind the transition to zero emissions technology, the different types of technologies being considered, and some of the barriers that the transportation industry still needs to overcome to adopt this technology. And just a couple housekeeping items that to touch base with you on. The webinar is being recorded, and so we will be sending the recording to you after we're finished today. You're welcome to share this with anyone else on your team that might find the information shared here helpful for anything that you guys are working on. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, we will have time for Q&A at the end, so please submit those questions to me, and they will be shared at the end of the presentation. So today's speaker is Paul Kroes. He is the Market Insights Leader for Thermo King Americas. In this role, he drives insights regarding customer and market performance, as well as technological trends and implications for the company. He's been with Thermo King since 2007. And as an engineer, he spent 5 years for the company designing Thermo King vehicle power transport refrigeration and APU units. And so he will be our presenter for today, and I will pass it over to Paul to continue on with the presentation.
All right, thank you, Minda. I appreciate that, and thank you everybody who is joining today. So today, the topic is certainly the transition for truck to zero emission technology, which for the sake of this conversation really revolves around batteries. Now, the definition and the scope of this, right, you can go really deep or you can go really broad. We're kind of choosing a bit of a middle path. We are not going to really dive deep into infrastructure that's required to support this, nor will we go into the trailer side of things. We do plan additional webinars in the future that will cover both of those topics in greater detail. But for today's discussion, we are really going to focus on the light and medium duty truck segments. Now, the definition of what light and medium duty is varies to everybody. For the sake of our conversation, we're mostly going to group them into class 1 through 4 as light duty and medium duty as 5 through 7, but we understand that where that line or classification or nomenclature is can vary. Overall, we're also going to basically focus on three main areas that we consider to be motivating factors for transitioning to zero emission vehicles. And those are regulations, total cost of ownership or TCO, and the environmental benefits. So let's dive into the biggest topic of late, which is regulations. It should be no surprise to everybody here that California, or CARB, is leading the way on the regulatory side as it relates to truck. Their primary focus has been to regulate on the medium duty segment, and this is as a consequence where most of the OEMs are focusing their zero emission development efforts. Now, there are significant efforts underway in the light duty segment, in the class 1, 2, and 3 areas, but those are currently not being regulated from a refrigeration standpoint by CARB. Additionally, there has been a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, across a number of states that came out last year. And finally, the Biden administration and the EPA are very likely to ramp up pressure on the federal side to create a stronger regulatory environment for zero emission as well. So let's talk about CARB a little bit more in detail, since that is the most progressive and the most defined regulatory body out there right now. So as it relates to both the truck and the TRU side of things, you can see that on the right side, there are different degrees of adoption over the next 15 years, depending on what segment you're in. So in the class 7 and 8, so basically the large truck where you're going to see your very heavy duty segments as well as long haul, those sales are required to transition upwards of 40% by essentially 2032. But they are starting small, and everything here is designed to start around basically January 1st of 2024, even though the regulation states December 31st of 23. Now, when you start to go beyond or smaller than class 7 and 8, you get to the class 4 on up segments. And those, while they follow a similar trend to the 7 and 8, they do continue to climb up through 2035 to the 55% mark. When you get even smaller vehicles, that's where the transition does accelerate even faster. It starts at a higher percentage of 9% in 24, and then growing to 75% by 2035. The disconnect starts to come when you look at the required transition for TRUs, or transport refrigeration units, on those vehicles. And you can see that the blue line on the chart starts at 15% in 24, so it's already higher than the other vehicle classes, and it rapidly climbs to 100% by 2030. So essentially they are mandating that 1/7 of fleets transition their transport refrigeration units on truck classes to electric or zero emission starting in 2024. So that is where the difficulty comes for operators in the state. They have to decide what they are transitioning and how they're going to transition, given that on the refrigeration side, they're going to have to adopt zero emission much quicker than what they would be required to on the chassis side of things. So the debate for them is going to be, do you adopt a zero emission chassis to pair with a zero emission TRU well ahead of what CARB requires, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you discount the burdens of added cost, the infrastructure required to charge that, and all the other difficulties associated with transitioning. The alternative is, do you start to mix technologies and apply zero emission TRUs to combustion engine chassis? While that's possible and feasible and does present some benefits, you're starting to mix technologies to account for a relatively short time span to accommodate and meet the letter of the law. So when it comes to CARB, I think there are some things that fleets are going to have to work out relative to timing. And of course, having the infrastructure and the funding behind that will drive a lot of decision making for the fleets. So I talked about the 15-state Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, as it's been known to be called. This came out, I believe, in June of last year, and essentially it's a pact or a coalition of 15 additional states, including Washington, D.C., where they aspire to mirror CARB's goals as much as possible. And so as the initial language came out, they are targeting 30% of sales for zero emission vehicles by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So I would say those are fairly reasonable goals. Again, this is a non-binding resolution among the states, and so they are free to do whatever they would wish. And of course, there have already been additional states that have signed on in a similar effect, including Nevada and Virginia was a big state recently that passed legislation that is going to start to mandate zero emission vehicles in the state. So I would say that in a few years, what is going to really happen is you're going to have a de facto national policy on driving to zero emission vehicles, especially on the commercial side. As of late, there has been a lot of noise pointing to how much of the total emissions created by the United States, 29% of that comes from transportation. And so there's, as a consequence, a lot of focus now on reducing that because it has surpassed grid emissions. So whether it's going to be California alone, or you see a mixture of various states across the union starting to mandate that, or again the federal or EPA side mandating it, you're going to see enough pressure nationally that you not only drive the innovation and funding and infrastructure support to actually implement it, but fleets that operate outside of maybe a small niche area or geographic area are going to be required to transition because they may operate in a different state where they do have to comply with the zero emission rules. So a regulation is not the only thing that fleets have to account for, but it does drive it on its own. However, the motivating factor for businesses is certainly profit and the total cost of ownership associated with having either internal combustion engine vehicles, or ICE, as we'll abbreviate it here, or electric. So when you look at a traditional ICE vehicle, the cost associated with that vehicle is really spread out among the different areas of that, whether you're talking interior, exterior, electronics, powertrain, whatever it is. You can see from the chart in the top right that it is fairly evenly spread out. When you transition to electric vehicles, that is where the bulk of the cost really lies in the powertrain. And within that powertrain, essentially 90+% of that is made up of batteries. So you can essentially think of it as half of a vehicle's cost, electric vehicle's cost, lies in that battery pack. And so when the industry talks about reducing the cost of those batteries over time and having line of sight to getting under $100 per kilowatt, for example, that's what's really going to have that meaningful impact on reducing the upfront purchase cost of that. And it's exactly because of this, because half of that cost lies solely in those batteries. So as the cost of batteries relates to, or drives down, it subsequently drives down the cost of the EV, you're going to see a quicker payback associated with those vehicles. And so on the bottom right is a current estimate of a payback period of an electric vehicle versus a equivalent internal combustion engine version. So for example, today in 2021, if you were to buy a class 6 vehicle, for example, you're looking at 12, 13 years of payback to achieve parity with what you would have gotten if you'd purchased an equivalent combustion engine version. And of course, as battery prices come down, economies of scale start to take over, those costs do generally trend downwards through the next 5 years. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is that it's not just combustion, or it's not just EVs that will get more cost effective, but it's the cost of the combustion engines that can get more costly. And they could get more costly because of regulations. As emissions continue to be regulated, that drives additional costs into those vehicles. One upcoming example, particularly again from CARB, is additional burdens of warranties associated with it, and emissions regulations that are going to significantly increase the cost of those in the 2027 period. And that is why you see a sudden drop between 26 and 27 on the chart. Now, of course, this can change and be a little bit better depending on sub-applications. So this chart in particular takes into account the TRU associated with that vehicle. So if you were to take out the TRU and have just the vehicle itself, the payback periods would tend to be quicker. But if you get into other applications, like utilities that require boom trucks, that can also provide different payback periods. But as a whole, it's going to be the chassis that drives it and determines it. And from what we can see, we have 5 to 6 years before you start to see a meaningful payback period. And by meaningful, I mean, I would think a fleet has to see a payback period within their time of, within their trade cycle. And the trade cycle is really how long do they own the vehicle before they either trade it in or scrap it. And for a lot of truck fleets, it's somewhere in that 7 to 10 year period before the vehicles tend to rust out or the maintenance starts to get really high. And so you can see from the chart that even in the next 4 years, it's very difficult to justify any sort of payback within a fleet's traditional payback period. The additional thing to consider here as well is the life of the batteries. So currently, batteries today tend to last about 8 years. And of course, that varies depending on the number of cycles, the depth of discharge, and some other factors that the vehicle experiences. But by about 2025, we expect that payback period to be upwards of 10 to 12 years. So already a 50% gain in the next 5 years. That will start to add additional value on the resale of that. And by 2030, it's expected that the battery life will be upwards of 15 years. So again, now when you start to sell that vehicle, it could actually have value in its second life. But one thing to consider over the next 5 years is if a company does buy a vehicle, not only do they not get that payback within their trade cycle, but either they're going to have to replace the batteries because it goes beyond those 8 years, or the vehicle itself has no value to it because the batteries are going to have to be replaced by the second owner. So again, it's total cost of ownership does take into account not only your purchase cost, but your operating cost and then that resale value. And it's all those factors that have to get better. So your initial cost is going to come down because of batteries. Your ownership costs will probably stay fairly stable because you're not, electricity costs aren't going up and down really. And your end cycle needs to get better because those batteries need to actually have some value and life left in them when you go to sell that vehicle. So let's talk about the third bucket, which is going green, or the environmental benefits. So a lot of fleets have the mandate to drive down emissions. There have been a lot of announcements lately by larger companies, including Walmart is a great example. Pepsi is another one that have said we are going to cut emissions by this amount. And Trane Technologies, who is the parent company of Thermo, we have our own gigaton challenge that drives us to reduce our total emissions for not only us, but in our customers over the next decade. But as it relates to EVs, the question continues to come up of, are EVs really cleaner or greener than their internal combustion engine equivalents? And the answer is yes, but it's complicated. It's not as simple as simply thinking, well, I'm driving an electric vehicle down the road and therefore I don't have any emissions, versus a gas guzzling SUV right next to me has exhaust coming out the tailpipe. While that's true, you have to think about the lifetime emissions associated with each vehicle type. So for example, the production in a battery electric vehicle produces significantly higher CO2 emissions than a combustion engine equivalent. By some estimates, depending on the size of the vehicle, the range can be quite large, but between 15 to 70% more CO2 emissions are created in the building and production of that battery electric vehicle. And that mostly includes the costs associated with the batteries themselves. Now, overall, that can add up to be 30 to 40 tons or more additional CO2 just to make that EV. So over the life of that vehicle now, we have to make that up. And so the chart on the right gives an example of what you can see per year of the equivalent all-electric production versus gasoline or hybrid or plug-in hybrid. So if I were to compare driving a vehicle, an all-electric vehicle versus the gasoline, it's about 60 to 70% less emissions are produced per year on that battery electric vehicle. So it only really takes a few years to make up and account for that battery electric vehicle emissions production penalty, if you will. And again, the chart on the far right is related to passenger vehicles, and it's not been studied for commercial vehicles simply because the scales of batteries tend to be significantly greater. But an easy way to think about it is a commercial electric vehicle can be anywhere from 2 to 3 times the impact of not only the production penalty, but also your annual equivalent for CO2 savings. So it does scale accordingly. So I would say that overall, a commercial vehicle, an electric commercial vehicle, might produce somewhere around, say, 10 to 12,000 pounds of CO2 equivalent because they're pulling that from the grid, versus a gasoline might produce about 30,000. So every year you might be saving upwards of 20,000 pounds of CO2 by having that battery electric vehicle on the road. Now, when I say, clearly there are emissions from the all electric, well, that's because of the charging required from the grid. And so as the grid continues to transition to renewable resources, that's where we'll see an even greater difference and have a better, greener or environmental business case for the electric side. But you can see that on a national level today, natural gas makes up more than 1/3, which is a fairly clean, production technology, but is not renewable. Coal is by far the dirtiest, and that still makes up almost 1/4 of national electric production. And then you get into, cleaner, right? So nuclear is not renewable, but it is clean. And then of course you have wind and hydro and solar. Now, globally, during the pandemic, the acceleration of renewable power production actually had its greatest leap ever. And they expect that trend to continue. And if subsidies come out, especially in the United States, from the Biden administration, that will likely further accelerate things like wind, hydro, and solar, and further decarbonize the grid, which will, again, further help the environmental case for running an electric vehicle. But the takeaway here is that it's not a free ride for emissions when it comes to electric, at least not yet. So let's talk about some of the industry barriers. I'm not going to go into all of these in great detail, but I'll free to take questions on these at the end. But the major factors affecting it are limited range. We'll dig into that a little bit more. Infrastructure is certainly a big topic that we'll talk about a little bit. You do have increased weight associated with electric vehicles simply because the battery packs are significantly heavier. You do have the higher upfront costs that we talked about. Component reliability is an unknown right now. So that's an interesting topic because on an equivalent combustion engine vehicle today, right, you have your annual oil changes, you have engines that are going to fail, you have emissions devices that need cleaning or replacing. But on the electric side, you really don't have those kind of failures. However, when it comes time for a component to actually fail, whether it's an inverter, maybe it's batteries, right, or a controller, those are very expensive repairs. And not only are they expensive, but most in-house operations will likely not be able to repair those on their own. And so the service is going to have to go back to the OEM themselves or to more qualified technicians. And that's an interesting point too, because not only are technicians in short supply in the industry today, which is not unique to transport, but it is a big problem. But now the skill set of future technicians is going to have to further transition to more skilled on the electric side in particular. So component reliability is a bit of an unknown and something that everyone is working to solve, but there's a lot of unknowns when you get into that 6-10 year life of that vehicle and you start to break, components that are worth thousands of dollars a piece. Is that, total cost of ownership really there? And then of course we talked about the expected battery life, right? So we're already at 8 years. We will double that in the next decade, but until then, it is a concern. So let's talk about infrastructure first and why that's a bit of a challenge. And again, we will have future webinars that will dive much deeper into infrastructure. But for now, the high level points are that fleets are really planning on installing their own charging infrastructure. There has been a debate about third-party offsite chargers that can support it. So maybe the fleet charges offsite and then comes back to base to load up and then goes out. But operationally, all of the feedback has been that it's a very inefficient way of doing it. And at the end of the day, it will be most beneficial for distribution centers and fleets in general to just install their own charging infrastructure on site. But of course, the largest barrier that companies face is the cost associated with it. Now, there are a lot of grant funding opportunities that currently exist with utilities, and it's not just in California. Nationally, there are quite a few incentives that exist, and whether that's hoping to subsidize installations up to the facility itself or even up to the charger itself. So it just depends on the utility and the state and incentives that do exist. I will say that one thing that is very interesting is that it is utilities that are ultimately driving this transition, even though it's the states that are really providing the funding for it. But what we have found is that states are giving a mandate to utilities to go out there and transition their customers to it. And so the burden is on the utilities to not only create these programs and roll out the funding, but they also have to figure out how much power is required to charge a commercial electric vehicle, how much power is needed by a TRU that's parked at a facility, right? All of those power requirements are new to everybody, including utilities. And so it's up to everybody to work together. And I think the more or sooner fleets can talk to their utilities, the better off they'll be, the better off everybody will be, because everyone will have a better idea of what it takes, not only from a cost standpoint, but from a grid standpoint and from a timing. Let's talk about range then. So range anxiety is real. So anyone who owns a passenger electric vehicle today knows that, especially in colder climates, being able to go 200 to 300 miles is a big concern, right? Ranges on passenger vehicles are finally starting to get the mid 2s to 300s and even higher in some cases. But when you start to get to cold weather, right, that can drop by half simply because you're trying to heat the batteries, heat the cab, and pull all that power out for different applications. Now, when you look at the commercial vehicle sector, those ranges also vary quite a bit, and it really depends on the application. So a vehicle that's maybe in the class 1 or 2 segment, it doesn't need to go 300-400 miles because it's just going to, a few miles away, doing its stops, and coming home, and maybe it experiences 50 miles worth of range. Versus a class 6 or 7, maybe more regional based, and those need to go 150 to 200 miles. Now, most estimates point to truck applications needing about that 100 to 125 miles of usable range. And so you start to add on a bit of a safety factor, which means you need about 150 to have some confidence. But then the problem is when you start to add on additional loads from a TRU, for example, that can pull upwards of 30% of the power out of that chassis battery pack to support cooling. Right now, you're further reducing the range of that, and all that has to be accounted for. So it's not, we're not saying that it's impossible or that it's a showstopper, but it does need to be accounted for with the OEMs themselves. The customers need to understand that when they read 150 miles on a spec sheet from a vehicle, there are a lot of factors associated with that, and it likely does not take into account the added loads from high-powered accessories like refrigeration. So overall, you can see from the chart on the right, there are quite a few range publications from the different OEMs. Now, these are going to continue to increase as batteries get better, as fleets increase their options. There is quite a bit of talk around having additional battery packs available on chassis to support loads like TRUs. And so that would mitigate or completely offset the additional burden or range anxiety associated with like TRU applications. But it certainly comes at an added cost, both monetarily and weight. There are some ways, though, that refrigerated applications in particular can reduce range anxiety. And one of those is through real-time range prediction. And by that, we mean providing real-time feedback to fleet operations managers or the drivers themselves as the day goes on to say, here's how much power you have and here's how much range you have. And by communicating between the refrigeration unit and the chassis itself, those calculations can be created and communicated. Advanced route planning is also something that the industry is going to have to get used to. And that is something that like a fleet like UPS, for example, that reportedly don't make left turns because it's more fuel efficient to just always go right. That's an example of its advanced route planning. So maybe it's not just leaving it up to the driver to figure out what stops they go to when, but actually mapping out within an urban area, for example, how they get there, where they go based on traffic conditions, right turns, and the ambient condition of the day. Also, accessory power consumption is a big one. And so that really refers to how much power is that refrigeration unit really going to consume, and how does that relate to the range available on that chassis. And that's really only going to come about by experience, right? So Thermo King is able to model power consumption based on operator assumptions. So what's the set point they have in the box? What is the outside temperature? How many times are they opening the door? There are a lot of factors that go into daily power consumption, but as time goes on, those will be able to be rolled up into much more accurate estimates, which will be fed to the OEMs, which can be fed into specifications, and ultimately to the customer to be more informed about what the right solution is holistically. So the other challenge that is not really preventing the industry from adopting it, but is something that the suppliers to the industry, such as chassis providers and Thermo King, have to deal with, and that is integration. Now, historically, integration of a refrigeration unit onto a chassis is very simple. You have the chassis, you have the body manufacturer, and you have the refrigeration unit. There historically has to be very little communication between all of those parties to create the end product. Right, everything has just evolved to essentially work. Everybody has a general understanding of what standards are, even if they're informal standards. Well, electrification is really turning all of that on its head, because now the TRU really needs to be integrated into the chassis itself. Right, pulling power directly from the chassis batteries is by far the most efficient way of charging or powering the TRU. Secondly, the requirements actually to power a TRU can be quite large. So, we talked about that 30% range estimate reduction as an example, but when you look at a TRU, you could see anywhere from 3 to 5 kilowatt power draw, upwards of 12 kilowatts on your larger vehicles. That's a significant amount of power while that's running. And so you can run that through different electronics, but every time you do that, if you invert it or convert it, you have power loss efficiencies, and that results in range reduction. So that's something that we're really trying to avoid. And so by working with the chassis manufacturers directly, ensuring that refrigeration units integrate directly into those batteries, and that not only that, but they communicate with the vehicles, we can ensure the most optimal solution for customers that's the most cost effective. So it's the most efficient solution possible, and it results in really the most range that they can possibly get, and therefore everyone will be happier. But it does present a challenge that the industry as a whole is not used to whatsoever. Now, of course, refrigeration is not the only application where this is a challenge. You have high accessory loads or situations like dump trucks, cement mixers, boom trucks, city vehicles. Anything that has large moving components on it will likely have the similar concerns and requirements. And so the chassis manufacturers would be best suited to create a more accessory friendly architecture. And you're starting to see that particularly in the startups, but the incumbent OEMs, the larger ones that are used to traditional design, I think are struggling on that side a little bit. Now, secondly, one of the bigger challenges as it relates to refrigeration in particular is having that refrigeration unit operate while the vehicle is off. Now, off is in quotes here because what does off really mean when most vehicles don't actually even have an ignition switch? So today you go in there and you turn the key or you put it to accessories, and that would allow the refrigeration unit to run. But in the future, when that is completely dependent upon the chassis batteries, that has to have access to that power from those batteries at all times. The problem is most OEMs, for safety reasons, prefer to have the vehicle's power shut off all the way up to that battery and not allow for additional accessory loads. Now that is something that will have to be solved. I think the industry is starting to migrate away from that and allow for scenarios where operators can keep their refrigeration unit running while still presenting a safe situation. But then it presents a challenge of at what point do you turn off or start to mitigate the load on that refrigeration unit if the vehicle is starting to experience low range. But then the debate goes even further of what does the operator prefer? Would the operator prefer to have the chassis have the range preserved so they can get home and then plug in? Or do they want that load to be preserved at all costs? Because if there's several $100,000 worth of product in the back of it, the last thing you want is to lose all of that when you can tow the vehicle home and try to squeeze out as much end power as you can out of it. And so there's no one solution to any of these, but I think having choice and flexibility between both the chassis and the refrigeration unit is going to be key to offering the industry with the best performance and options possible. Now, the last point is fuel cells. Now, fuel cells have been discussed a lot as of late. There have been several companies not only creating fuel cell trucks, but the infrastructure required. As we see it, fuel cells will really be best suited for those long hauls or your regional trucking applications. Whether we see it specifically in the medium duty and maybe in the light duty segment is yet to be seen. But fuel availability, which is essentially hydrogen, the availability and pricing will dramatically impact the adoption and investment into fuel cells themselves. And it is not a clear picture on that right now. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So while fuel cells do continue to make quite a bit of progress, especially as of late, and they're gaining industry confidence as a potentially viable technology to replace diesel, there are still significant concerns around durability, your system cost, the fuel availability itself, right? You have to have a hydrogen economy, as it's been known to be called, and of course, hydrogen fuel prices themselves. Now, it takes about 3 times the amount of power to get reform and transport hydrogen to its end location than it does to simply charge a battery. And so that additional power requirement also needs to be taken into account. But as it stands today, estimates are 2030 to 2035 before fuel cells come into parity with diesel, versus, of course, from what we just discussed, electric side will come into parity probably 5 to 10 years before fuel cells. And so while fuel cells could have line of sight to adoption, I think long haul is the best bet for where they will most be favored, because it presents you with a zero emission long haul fuel equivalent to diesel versus packing 2 megawatts worth of batteries on a tractor, which is a lot of weight, a lot of cost, and that means you still have to charge it. So the future is uncertain on fuel cells. I think it's a little bit brighter than it was a couple years ago, but it's still very unknown to us. And so the last slide here, let's just sum up all of this into what transition timing looks like. So we talked about the regulations that are going to start to force adoption in 2023 in particular. We talked about total cost of ownership that, while is still very high, will eventually come down into something more reasonable by the 2026-27 time period. And of course, you have the broader states or federal side of regulatory environment that might force adoption much quicker. And so you can see from a transition chart that really we expect as a whole only about a third of the entire industry to currently transition by about 2040. So some of you may be thinking, well, that actually seems fairly low based on everything we've been seeing. But keep in mind that as it stands today, California only makes up about 12% of the total truck population in the country. And until other states or federally create firm regulations promoting that, there's really nothing else that's going to drive that. So this case here, I would say, is probably the slow or baseline case, if you will. Also, it does not take into account funding that will likely be associated with regulations, again, whether that's on the state level or on the federal. But as it stands today, there's no great holistic policy or funding mechanism for fleets to transition. In California, there are several options available today, and I expect others to follow, but it's not as clean cut as it should be. So that's what we're seeing. So we have a good 10 years before we start to see really rapid transition across the entire United States to zero emission, but it is coming, and it's going to take several factors to really get it there or to accelerate it. That is the end of this. We'll open it up for questions, or Minda, I'll let you do any housekeeping.
All right, thank you. Yes, a couple questions that we've had come through here. So the first question is, what about range extending technologies like solar on top of a truck to power the TRU? What would be the possibilities there?
Yeah, great question. That is something that does come up quite frequently. There are several range extension technologies that are possible. I would say on the truck side versus trailer, right? But on truck specifically, the two main technologies are going to be solar and regenerative axles. Now, regenerative axles, I'll just cover that first, right? Those are mostly inherent to electric vehicles themselves. And so I think having efficient regen axles, particularly in high accessory applications like refrigeration, are going to be critical to extending that range, and they're particularly useful in urban environments. Now, solar is a whole nother matter, and the issue with solar really is predictability. And the reason why predictability is important is fleets really need to depend on how much range they're going to get in a given day, because the last thing they want is to have to look at the weather forecast every morning and worry about, are they going to get through the day because it's either sunny or not sunny enough, or maybe it's too hot, or maybe it's really hot and cloudy, which would be the worst case scenario. So all of these really create huge variability for solar. The second thing is really power density. So solar panels, while they have improved dramatically in the past 10 years, right, you can only really fit upwards of, say 400 to 500 watts on a small, like class 2 or 3 vehicle, to maybe a couple kilowatts on a larger class 6 or 7 vehicle. That's not a small amount, but it really is not impactful to the end range. And our estimates and trials that we've done show that it gets you upwards of maybe 3 to 5 extra miles on that truck, which is negligible at best. So for the cost and complexity associated with installing solar on top of a truck, if the motivation is to go green, for 1/5 of the cost, you can put that same solar on top of a distribution center and use it to feed the grid or charge your vehicles. But then additionally, you also have the risk of someone scrapes a tree limb across it and ruins everything. And again, the cloudiness, you have dirtiness of it can impact it. And overall, solar is not advancing at nearly the rate that batteries themselves are. So every year, solar maybe gets 1 to 2% more power dense and cheaper, but batteries are improving at double-digit rates. And so as time goes on, solar continues to lose out as a viable option to batteries, for example. But the counter argument is, well, every bit of power you can put into the batteries from solar on the truck reduces the amount of power that has to come out of a facility to charge it and the amount of time theoretically that it has to be plugged in. And so maybe they can turn it around faster. And while that's true, it's yet to be determined if that benefit is worth the cost and complexity of managing your operations to account for the variability of what solar can do.
Thank you, Paul. One other question we had come through is um, if there was one or even two things that you would recommend a company could do right now to prepare for the transition, what would that be?
Yeah, great question. The number one thing is to start talking to utilities. So we talked about infrastructure briefly and how important it is to start to figure out what those power calculations are going to look like. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be theoretical, but even just having that first discussion around what kind of power is available from the grid, what current facility infrastructure exists, or if a fleet is going to be building a new facility or upgrading, there's no better time than to try to get power lines run through the facility in the ground wherever you may think it's going to be. The vast majority of infrastructure costs comes from tearing up, parking lots to run the power and install the transformers. But if that work can be done up front, just to even in the general sense to prepare for the future, fleets in general and facilities can save a tremendous amount of money and hassle down the road. So that's number one. Number two is talking to equipment providers, whether it's a chassis or a company like Thermo to start to understand what's coming, what is going to be required. Thermo itself has a customer council where fleets are encouraged to participate and provide feedback on how are they going to operate, what do they want to see, right? It's having the conversations with everybody as much as possible is really helping everyone reduce the uncertainty and create that end solution, because no one really knows the exact answer and there's so many unknowns. But by just having an open dialogue in as many forms as possible, the end result will be much better than if Thermo, for example, were to guess what an end customer is going to want just completely in the dark without any sort of input.
All right, thank you. Well, those are all the questions that we had come through. So I think that wraps up our time for today. So again, thank you everyone for participating and making the time to meet with us today to talk on this very important topic that's facing the industry right now. As I mentioned earlier, later today you'll see a recording of the presentation come to you as well as a white paper. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.